On my first read-through of Rupi Kaur's Milk and Honey, I sat back and I thought to myself, wait, I have seen this before. Not the specific story it tells, which follows a young immigrant woman growing up and learning about love, but its shape, its pacing. I've seen these pages of one-sentence quatrains, each of which is an isolated image or aphorism. I've seen these poems that repeat themselves far too often, these poems that are afraid to leave anything unsaid lest even a single person fail to understand what they mean. I've seen these poems because I have written them. I have written Milk and Honey. I've written it on my notes app, on scraps of paper torn out of class notebooks, in journals going back as far as I can remember. And while my own personal Milk and Honey is about religion, queer love, animals, non-binary identity, that kind of thing, in a structural sense, it is more or less the same. Going back into these old documents of mine and running my metaphorical hand over these scattered verbal knickknacks, some of which are promising and others of which are probably going to end up in the trash, is a lot like what it feels like to read Milk and Honey. But let me put it this way. Milk and Honey isn't a poetry collection. Not really. It's more like a bag of wildflower seeds that Kaur bought at a hardware store. Seeds that, instead of planting and caring for, she's decided to frame in her living room. Bag and all. Or, if you believe what Kaur herself has said about it, it is a prayer book. It's a book of hours, a liturgy delivered directly from capital S Spirit into your hands via the medium of Rupi Kaur. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I'm actually so nervous to record this one. Man, it's been a hell of a time getting this done. I've been writing this on and off for about a year, and within the last week I've tried to record it, 4 separate times? I've had all kinds of audio issues thanks to my new computer, and once I finally managed to get one solid recording done, I realized that I was pretty unhappy with a couple of key parts of the script, so I had to rewrite it. I feel a lot of pressure to get this one right, like, this has to be the one. It's like, if the Marie video was kind of bad, that's okay. It was like my first one. If the Jordan Peterson one was kind of bad, that's okay. I experimented with that one in some ways too. Originally Red from our Wild Animus video was supposed to be in the Jordan Peterson poetry episode, but then that got cut, which led to a whole bunch of rearranging. So this time, though, it feels like I've got to get it right. Rupi Kaur is somebody that not only does the general public think about her a lot because she is probably the world's most famous quote-unquote poet, but also people in my immediate writing circle have lots of thoughts about her. So it's one that people have opinions about, and I want to make sure that I state my case as cleanly and as exactly as I possibly can so that the conversation around Rupi Kaur is moved forward rather than just stagnating where it's been for so long, which has been, haha, isn't her poetry bad? Versus, actually, no, she's the most brilliant person ever. Hopefully I'm landing it. I really look forward to everybody's comments after this video has been uploaded. Positive or negative, I welcome it all. I've poured a lot of myself into this, more than I do even for other video essays, and so I hope that it's good. But if it's not, I want to know that too, because that's good data. So, without further ado, here it is, the Rupi Kaur video, finally. Depending on who you ask, Rupi Kaur can be one of two completely different people. To some, she is a joke, and a bad one. She's a name that every poetry professor dreads hearing uttered in their classroom. But to other people, she's something of a literary liberator, her success a strike against an elitist publishing establishment, and a harbinger of a more egalitarian age of poetry. Before she had the chance to be either of those things, though, she was just some kid. Kaur was born in Punjab, India, but immigrated to Canada alongside her parents when she was still very young. She has dropped enough snippets of her life across interviews and elsewhere that a dedicated biographer could probably piece together a pretty detailed life story at this point, but for our purposes, suffice it to say her youth was a turbulent one. Even just reading Milk and Honey, we start to get a sense of this. There was substance abuse in her home. She struggled with her sense of self-worth. There was conflict with her parents, and her parents' culture often clashed with the one in which they were raising their daughter. Much later, Kaur studied rhetoric and professional writing at the University of Waterloo, and apparently even ran her own creative writing workshops at one point, even before she became famous. So far, so English Club podcast, but what some listeners may not know is that Kaur's rise to fame was the result of her photography and not her poetry. In 2015, Rupi Kaur became Instagram and Tumblr famous when she posted a photograph of herself waking up with menstrual blood on her pants as part of a university project. The photograph was removed by Instagram twice, and Kaur and her already pretty sizable Instagram following responded with very justified outrage. This garnered her a lot of attention, and although Milk and Honey had already been self-published by that point, back in 2014, it wasn't until the book was picked up by Andrews McMeel Publishing, who had noticed Kaur in the wake of her battle with Instagram, that the book became a household title. So that raises the question, what the hell is this book even about? Milk and Honey is separated into 4 sections titled The Hurting, The Loving, The Breaking, and The Healing. The poems in each section are grouped roughly by topic, but also narrate the speaker's life in what I assume is chronological order. The titles of each section more or less explain themselves, so where in The Loving you'll find lots of poems about falling in love, in The Breaking most of the poems are about breakups and their fallout. No matter which section of the book you're in though, there are certain kinds of poems that you can always count on finding. For example, this is a piece that represents a significant percentage of the collection as a whole, which is to say it's more aphorism than poem. This poem, found on page 92 of my copy of M&H, feels like it's being coy while also staring me directly in the face. It feels coy on one hand because although it's clearly referencing a very specific set of circumstances in the speaker's life, it refuses to tell me what they actually are. Meanwhile, on the other hand, it feels like it's looking me directly in the face because it is explicitly offering me life advice. Neither of these features is inherently bad nor out of place in poetry. Mary Oliver's Wild Geese, which I'm not going to read now but will flash up on the screen in case you'd like to pause and read it, is a famous poem that does both of those things. No, it's like Rupi Kaur knows that poetry is supposed to work by suggestion, but misunderstands that to mean that it should be vague. When I say poems work by suggestion, I mean that they guide the reader towards conclusions that, because the reader reaches them on their own, feel more impactful than they would if the poem had stated them outright. Often describing a very specific set of circumstances in the speaker's life, whether fictional or real, is the means by which that suggestion occurs. Because of that, I think you could fix some of these life advice poems by reversing their priorities. If instead of focusing themselves around telling the reader what to do, the poems could describe the speaker's circumstances in such a way that they suggest the desired conclusion. Here is an example, and I hope it won't come across as gauche that I use one of my own poems as an example here, but it's one that I can say for sure was written with the intent to suggest certain actions on the part of the reader. This poem originally appeared in Zoetic Press's literary magazine as well as their podcast, which is called Alphanumeric. The poem is autobiographical, more or less. It's about missing my partner and my dog while I'm living here in Vienna, and one of the goals in writing the poem, not the only goal, but one of them, was to inspire readers to be appreciative of the people in their lives. But you'll notice, if you pause and read it, that it doesn't actually say that anywhere. Instead, it aims to suggest it, and I'm comfortable with readers getting other messages from the poem, or even construing those other messages as the primary one. That's kind of the whole thing with poetry. 15 lines of "I miss my dog and my boyfriend" might authentically represent my experience, but it would be a shit poem. Let's zoom out for a second though, and look at what makes a Rupi Kaur poem a Rupi Kaur poem. On the off chance you somehow have avoided contact with her work up until now, hopefully what we've covered so far has started to give you a feel for it, but still, I think there are some gaps that I need to fill in. If you saw my video on Joyce Sullivan, you'll probably remember a few of the traits of Kaur's work that I identified there. For example, Kaur poems tend to be hyper-autobiographical, by her own admission, and set in all lowercase. They're also really brief, and they're more invested in pathos. That is, engaging the surface-level feelings of the reader than they are in working with themes that might be challenging or ambiguous. That doesn't mean the content itself can't be challenging, but the themes that they explore or their takes on those challenges will never be unclear. Read a Rupi Kaur poem and in about 99% of cases, it all but tells you exactly how it wants you to feel. There is very little to interpret, and if something in one of the poems is left open, it probably has a lot to do with the circumstances of the situation the speaker is describing, as we saw in the previous example, rather than what the poem is about emotionally. That's all great, but what about craft? Content is one thing, but craft is the choices a poet makes when they deploy literary devices like metaphors, images, rhyme, meter, and so on. I couldn't possibly talk about Kaur's relationship to every element of craft, because quite frankly, she avoids using a lot of them, and it wouldn't be worth our time to try to find all the rest. Instead, I'm going to focus on Kaur's relationship to the line, since A, it's my favorite poetic device, and B, it's one she can't help but engage with, as much as she tries to avoid others. Wait a second. Do you hear that? Yeah, that's the theory alarm. It's time for some poetics. Okay, so, in James Longenbach's The Art of the Poetic Line, he argues that line breaks can mostly be categorized into three sorts. The third and final kind is end-stopped lines, which is lines that end in punctuation, especially a comma or period. But because Rupi Kaur almost never uses that, we can forget about it for today. The other two, which we're going to focus on, are more complicated, so I kindly ask that everybody lock the fuck in for a second. First, there's the annotated line, which is a line that breaks out of sync with the normal flow of language. These breaks tend to read as harsher, and can be used to create surprise and discovery, or to emphasize words normal prose just wouldn't. Take a look at the two annotated line breaks on the screen now. In the first, which is from a poem by Milton that Longenbach also references, the first line is syntactically complete. If it ended in a period, it would have meaning, but the first word in the line after it changes what the line would mean on its own, creating a moment where, as the reader's eye moves from the first line to the second, they're surprised. They have to stop and reevaluate what they thought the poem was saying. In the second, which is a poem by Kaur, the line, "a daughter should," is not syntactically complete, and the line break emphasizes should, which normal speech wouldn't. The line afterwards continues the phrase while also subverting it thanks to the not, similar to the Longenbach example. Neither of these functions, subversion or emphasizing odd words, is worse than the other. Both are just options that poets have. Keep that in mind as we take a look at the second type of Longenbach's lines, the parsing line. If end-stopped lines end a line in punctuation, and annotated lines break in places without punctuation where speech normally wouldn't pause, then there's really only one thing parsing lines can do, and that's exactly what they do. They break in places that feel quote-unquote natural, but without using any punctuation. In the same Kaur poem, the third line, "beg her father," feels like it ends more predictably. So does the final line, "for a relationship," of course, because it concludes a sentence. The pauses created by the moments where these lines end feel a bit more like the places a person might pause if they were speaking aloud. There's no universal ratio of annotated to parsing to end-stopped lines that will guarantee a poem's effectiveness. Instead, every poem has to find the arrangement best suited to its particular goals. My problem with much of Kaur's poetry on the level of craft is that her personal methodology is one built around not having a methodology, that is, on being arbitrary. I'll talk about some reasons for this later, but for right now, let's keep looking at this poem about Kaur's father. So, the first two lines are annotated, and the second two are parsing. Now the question becomes the ever-dreaded, so what? What is that doing? A good poem, in my estimation, will actually reward the asking of these questions, smarmy as they might seem at first. That is, good poems reward good faith, curiosity, and scrutiny. They can withstand it, and they make the reader feel that they have achieved something or learned something coming out the other side. This poem doesn't really do that, as many of Kaur's don't. The second line subverts the first, but that's all it does. That subversion, which in and of itself is fun, doesn't actually create any additional meaning. If you ask why it's doing that, you will be left wondering, because there just isn't an answer. It's a bit like a verbal firework. The rocket of the line is fired into the air and disappears, then bursts into colorful subversion, then fades into nothing. You can ask what the subversion means, but it doesn't. If you find meaning in a firework, it's meaning you have to assign for yourself. After a second annotated line that also doesn't really do much, we have our two parsing lines. Generously, you might say that after the irregularity of the poem's opening annotated lines, it settles into a more comfortable rhythm here at the end. But even if you do read it that way, I have to ask why. Why is it doing that? What effect is being achieved by opening the poem with this faltering pace that becomes more regular at the end? Maybe it lends more emphasis to the weighty subject matter of the single-sentence poem, but if so, that's undercut by the directness of the statement itself. If you read it normally, it would have the same emphasis, and those words would have the same weight. It's like this. If the poem is a single sentence that means exactly what it says, and the lines, or at least half of them, are only emphasizing the natural pauses of spoken language, why is the poem lineated at all? The answer, of course, is that if the poem wasn't broken into lines, it would cease to be recognizable as poetry, and this book needs to have its poems be recognizable as poetry, for reasons that we will talk about in just a second here. Look, there's no getting around the fact that Rupi Kaur has been subjected to immense reflexive hatred because she is a successful woman of color, financially outcompeting poets working within traditional academic publishing systems. Some academic poets, which includes poets who have advanced university training and want to publish poems in literary magazines of note before eventually signing book deals with the major presses, feel threatened by Kaur. They know that they, despite writing very intentional poetry grounded in years of academic study and analysis, not just of pre-existing poetic traditions, but of their own personal theories of poetry, will never have her success, and that probably includes me. It's an unfortunate fact that only a small percentage of the hundreds of talented, determined, ambitious, and extremely stylish young poets coming out of MFAs will never be able to support themselves through their art because there just aren't enough jobs, not to mention a general lack of interest in literary poetry. But, while I've heard experienced writers express a real dislike for Kaur, I also personally know academic poets who admire her for, allegedly, putting poetry back into the public consciousness. Personally, I am very hesitant to believe almost any of Rupi Kaur's fans will graduate beyond her work. To substantiate this hunch I had going into the writing of this essay, let's mosey on over to the Goodreads reviews of Milk and Honey, where we will find that extremely commonly, the positive reviews either say, "Hey, I'm not a poetry person, but I'm a fan of Kaur because she's authentic," or "This book reminded me to love myself," or comments that simply contain a copy-paste of a particular poem, accompanied by something along the lines of, "This poem really hit me in the feels." In the absence of any real data, this is for me evidence that readers of Kaur are interested in her work for something other than poetry as an art form. That mysterious something is, I think, the idea of poetry. Theoretically, Rupi Kaur could do everything she does in M&H in basically any artistic medium. Visual arts, film, music, whatever. All of these can remind people to love themselves, can present their creator as an authentic and honest individual, and can be clipped for their most emotionally charged moments. There's a specific reason poetry in particular works well for Kaur, though. See, in the public consciousness, poetry as a concept tends to be understood, when it isn't being thought of as a torture device invented by English teachers, that is, as in some way inherently prestigious, mythical, and wise. There's a general perception of poetry as delivered unto poets from beyond, infused with knowledge greater than the poet herself. In fact, Kaur herself has claimed that she believes this, but again, I am getting a little ahead of myself. Kaur leverages this widespread and misguided understanding of poetry in order to create the appearance that there is something transcendent about the contents of Milk and Honey. Simultaneously, she avoids engaging with the actual craft techniques that make poetry what it is in order to keep her target audience, who doesn't know how to interpret these craft elements and largely isn't particularly interested in trying, engaged. Just to make it super clear, I do not think fans of Rupi Kaur are dumb or incapable of engaging with more complex material. Not that anyone needs to hear this from me, but it is totally fine to like reading what Rupi Kaur has written, and it's even better if, in reading, you find some measure of comfort or the encouragement you need to improve your self-esteem. At the same time, I think it's necessary to be able to recognize that what you are reading when you read Kaur and how you experience it are not the same thing. Rupi Kaur is literary junk food, and again, that's okay, because sometimes junk food hits in that certain way at just the right moment and it turns a bad day around. If I can be vulnerable for a moment, I have my own media junk food, and one of those is that really terrible Sleepy Hollow TV show that aired in the mid-2010s, where Ichabod Crane is reimagined as this guy who woke up in the 21st century after dying in a sword fight with the Headless Horseman, who, by the way, has also reawakened in the 21st century, and now, all of a sudden, the events of the story are repeating themselves in the modern day. Whoa! The first season is arguably maybe okay, but it drops off extremely steeply after that, and there's basically no getting around that it's an inherently silly premise that isn't going to enlighten viewers about the human condition. Although it's based on a short story that I loved as a kid and still love to this day, it didn't encourage me to go read more literature. It was junk, but it was my junk, and I'm comfortable admitting that, and I'm comfortable saying those words in that order and posting them on the internet forever. All that to say, I don't think we can reinvigorate Kaur's work by arguing that at least it encourages people to read poetry, because if it did, Kaur's massive success would have been followed by a similarly large increase in general interest in other forms of poetry, which, in my anecdotal observation, just hasn't happened, like, at all. Ultimately, though, Rupi Kaur's goals are bigger than either the contents of her poems or the form in which they are packaged. They are actually beyond the scope of poetry itself, as I'll argue later, and Kaur's work positions her as a kind of prophet that has endured incredible hardship that has endowed her with wisdom to be passed on directly to you, the reader. This self-mythologizing is evident as early as the introduction to Milk and Honey, where Kaur describes the version of herself that wrote the book as otherworldly, like a beautiful extraterrestrial who does not belong on this planet but found herself on it. She had the capacity to consume the entire world in her fist. It struck me initially as uncomfortably self-congratulatory, but this kind of makes sense when you consider the implication that Kaur is offering her readers. Take the advice I have for you in this book, and you can be that strong too. Hell, maybe just by reading this book, you already are. Basically, what I'm saying is that, as far as poetry goes, the fact that Kaur calls her work poetry has pretty much nothing to do with a legitimate interest in the medium, its history and current iterations, and everything to do with her wanting to give her readers a certain feeling when they pick up her work. When she calls her work poetry, she wants to borrow all the profoundness that word popularly implies, but without having to engage with any of the craft elements that make that alleged profoundness possible in the first place. Returning to those academic poets who feel threatened by Kaur, though, if you really dislike Kaur and/or her work, but wouldn't have been able to say very much about her or it previous to getting this far in the video, it's probably because of the storm of negative opinion pieces that has swirled around her ever since M&H was released. In 2018, so that's 3 years after Milk and Honey was picked up by a publisher and really popped off, poet Rebecca Watts published an article titled "The Cult of the Noble Amateur" in PN Review, which is a British literary magazine of some note. Of course, there had already been dozens of critiques of Kaur by that point, but Watts' piece is notable because it's a takedown of Instapoets generally, not published as an opinion piece in a venue like The Guardian, but in an actual literary journal. Though Watts' article focuses slightly more on Kaur's UK contemporary, Instapoet Holly McNish, Watts uses McNish as a synecdoche or shorthand for Instapoets broadly. If you're a university student or some other person with access to ProQuest, I can highly recommend reading this article for yourself. But in case you can't or don't want to or just lack the time, the thrust of Watts' argument is this. Instapoetry overvalues quote-unquote honesty and accessibility, buzzwords for the open denigration of intellectual engagement and the rejection of craft. When Watts says craft, she means it in the same sense I did earlier, as a reference to the features of poetry as a medium that interact with but are separate from content. If you went and read the article yourself, I'd wager that you picked up on the palpable anger in Watts' tone throughout. This is at least in part because her target audience is not Instapoets themselves nor readers of Instapoetry, both people who would be turned off by the language she uses, but rather her fellow academics. Watts wants to make it absolutely clear that if you, as a student of poetry, promote Instapoetry, you are doing a disservice to art. Capital A. This is speculation, but I suspect Watts of being one of those poets I mentioned earlier, that is, an academic poet who has realized, as we all must realize when confronted with the reality of Rupi Kaur, that she will never have what Kaur has in terms of financial success, glamour, or public visibility. And I don't say any of that to disparage Watts at all. She is an extremely active poet, boasting a near-constant stream of publications and reading engagements according to her personal website. She has also published 2 well-received collections of poetry on top of her editing and teaching work. I say all this to say that I empathize with Watts, even if I don't wholeheartedly agree with her. And that's assuming I'm even correct in my assessment of her feelings towards McNish and Kaur. I understand why she might be frustrated with and frightened by a world in which her work is not being rewarded proportionately to the effort she puts in, even while poets who understand less of the medium are granted luxurious world tours and Amazon Prime specials. While I do think Watts' frustration with Instapoetry leads her to be overly critical in parts of her essay, she also raises several salient points. For one, she sounds the alarm on a very concerning sentiment expressed by Holly McNish's publisher. Quote, "The medium of poetry reflects our age, where short-form communication is something people find easier to digest and connect with." Here, McNish's publisher, willfully, I think, misunderstands poetry. While poetry is often short-form and it does exist to communicate, poetry is anything but digestible. As I've discussed on the channel countless times before, poetry requires more work from a reader than nearly any form of writing, and that isn't because the people who write it are elitist or hate you. It's just a feature of the form, as well as a product of a culture that doesn't educate on how to engage with said form. While a digestible poem is not inherently a failed one, a poem that sets out to be digestible has sold itself short before the first word is even on the page. Watts also makes the excellent point that when poetry and poetry readers overvalue quote-unquote honesty, a feature cited over and over in reviews of both Kaur and McNish's work, it devalues linguistic precision, and they forget that poems are not spontaneously occurring records of actual events, but rather artifice. Poems are, as Watts aptly puts it, deliberately created works, and it may not be in a work's best interest to be faithful to an author's moment-to-moment experience. In other words, poems exist to interpret moments, not to describe them. They are, in one sense, rhetoric, designed to convince readers of something. In many cases, that something is the intensity, immediacy, and significance of a feeling that arose out of a particular moment. And in order to do that convincing, poets remove, add, or tweak actual events in ways that enhance the reading experience. Hopefully that didn't get too theoretical, but either way, let's take another look at a poem from Milk and Honey. I think I know why Rupi Kaur didn't lineate lines 1 and 2 of the second stanza of this untitled poem so that they end on stronger words and flow more naturally. Once again, we see Kaur beginning a stanza with 2 consecutive annotated line breaks. These lines could easily be retooled to emphasize more thematically relevant words or rephrased to make the annotative line breaks intentionally subversive, and so on. But if she did that, her work might look a little too much like academic poetry, which would go against her desire to create art without artifice, as Kaur critic Chiara Giovanni writes. So instead, Kaur's strategy is to break lines on prepositions and other similarly weak words. This lets her work look arbitrary, sort of improvised. The problem with this is the obvious hypocrisy of it, something you probably noticed even as I was stating it. It's a style that's deliberately arbitrary. As soon as you make arbitrariness a pillar of your writing style, you have made it predictable and therefore no longer really arbitrary at all. This belies the fact that art is artifice. It is impossible for it not to be. Every single part of it is defined by expectations upon which humans collectively agree or collectively disagree. There is nothing objective about any of it. Fans of Kaur have argued that the improvisational appearance of these poems is part of what makes them more, say, authentic. But if, as I've argued, the arbitrariness of Kaur's style is a deliberate stylistic choice, then there is no longer anything quote-unquote authentic about it. It's as calculated as traditional literary poems are, just shallower in its execution. I'll close out this section with an open question for you, my dear club members. I have to admit I am not uber educated about art forms other than contemporary poetry and fiction. So if you're an English club attendee familiar with other arts, please let me know. Does this happen in your medium as well? Do people win acclaim by refusing to engage with the medium itself? And I'm not talking about established artists choosing to limit their toolkits in order to challenge themselves or comment on current trends. I am talking about people who reject the techniques of their chosen artistic medium out of a kind of proud ignorance. If you have examples, please share them in the comments below. I would love to start a conversation about what is going on here and why. On her website, Rupi Kaur tells the story of how she came to self-publish Milk and Honey. It goes like this. One day, presumably in office hours following an undergraduate workshop, Kaur asked her creative writing professor how she could get her poetry published, and according to Kaur, her professor responded in 3 ways. First, she said, poetry basically never gets published. Second, she said that Kaur should seek publication of individual poems in various literary magazines. And third, she said that under no circumstances should Kaur take the path of self-publication, as it would cause her to be, quote, looked down upon by her literary peers. To be honest, and I'm not proud of this, when I first read the story, I found myself skeptical of its veracity. It was difficult for me to believe a poetry professor would really say this to anyone, let alone an eager undergraduate student. The 3 pieces of quote-unquote advice I've already mentioned were bad enough, but what really shocked me was what Kaur tells us her professor said at the beginning of her answer before any of those. It was a simple 2 words. Don't bother. Though I found myself in complete disbelief initially, I had to take a step back and realize that we really have no grounds on which to disbelieve Kaur. Although I have been lucky enough to never have a creative writing professor this jaded, it doesn't mean that they don't exist, and statistically, I'm sure that they do. As much as we might want to believe that writers are preternaturally empathic people who must be in order to write about the world and humans, the facts are that we are capable of saying stupid and cruel shit just the same as anybody else. So if I may, I am going to turn directly to Rupi Kaur for a moment and say, Rupi, I am genuinely so sorry. This professor did you an incredible disservice as a young person interested in the arts, and you deserved better. As a teacher of poetry myself, the response your question received remains unfathomable to me. Never in my life can I imagine giving this answer, nor receiving it. The thing is, I have had students in their first semester of poetry ask me basically this exact question, and the way that I answer them is the way that I was answered when I asked more or less the same question as an undergraduate myself. First, I tell my students what to look for in a reputable literary magazine. This includes a masthead, which is a list of editors and their respective biographies. If the editors working at a magazine of your choosing have credentials, such as previous publications and/or teaching experience, that is a big green flag. Second, aspiring publishees should read some of the magazine they've picked out before submitting. This will help you see if a magazine's aesthetics and interests synergize with your own. And finally, I tell my students to see if the magazine has physical print issues. This certainly is not the case for every poet, or maybe even most poets, but I personally prefer to prioritize submitting to magazines with physical editions because those tend to have bigger budgets and are therefore more likely to stick around. Again, this isn't universally the case. I have received really lovely support on social media and elsewhere from smaller online-only publications, but resources and backing are always good things to keep in mind. With those 3 pieces of advice established, I also caution my students against publishing too early, especially if I'm talking to a student from a first semester writing workshop. It's sort of an uncomfortable fact that most beginning poets just are not ready to publish, even if, in the rush of excitement that might accompany learning a new skill, they feel motivated to at least try. And this is by no means because they suck. It's often because they just haven't yet come to grips with the bare-bones fundamentals of craft, or because their poems are still emulating the things that they've read, or because they haven't found their unique voice yet. I don't say any of that, though, unless asked directly. Instead, I caution my students against publishing too early on the grounds that if they intend to seriously pursue poetry, 10 years from now, they may not want one of the first verses they ever wrote to stand as a publicly available representation of their work. You'll notice I don't even mention self-publication in any of my answers, and that's because unless a student specifically asks about it, I just don't bring it up. Self-publication can be, in my limited experience, a bit like a pitcher plant. It's this quirky, sweet-smelling curiosity that seems enticing from the outside. I mean, what's not to like, right? You retain total creative control of the project, and maybe best of all, you can release it now, like right this second. So let's say you do. But then what happens? Well, if you're like 99% of self-pubbed writers, you slip into the throat of the pitcher plant, only to find it's full of the abandoned, liquefying remains of 1,000 other writers just like you. Ultimately, what have you gotten out of it, other than the short-term dopamine hit that comes along with being able to say you published something? Because I'll tell you what you don't get, and what you don't get is the support of editors who can bring new perspectives to your work, nor the support of a publisher financially invested in your success, nor the existence of design experts to help with things like layout and cover art. This isn't all just hypothetical either. I have actually seen writers do this, self-pub their work because they want to be able to say they've published, and as a result they put work into the world that's blatantly unfinished. In order to achieve published poetry, they cheat themselves of the poetry itself, of the experience of learning about craft, and, yes, by struggling. Much like what we saw with Alex Astor do during our Nightbane episode, and just like with Nightbane, the result can be published work released in a state of now permanently arrested development. Rupi, I can empathize with how much this answer must have jarred and wounded you, but I also have to ask. After a bit of reflection, and this didn't have to happen as an undergrad, but maybe as an adult, did you never think to yourself, hold on, what my professor told me can't be the whole story? After all, if there's no point to publishing, then how are poets getting published? And how are they, few though they might be, making a living writing and teaching? Rupi, I know there are other creative writing teachers at Waterloo, and I reckon chances are good you encountered them at some point. Did you ever ask for a second opinion? That's what I would have done. Hell, that's what I did, even though all of my professors over the years gave me permutations of roughly the same uplifting advice. It seems like instead you became something of a reactionary, or at least became a figure attractive to people who trend towards reactionary ideology, which is what I'd like to talk about next. When conversations online turn to the quality of Rupi Kaur's work, you'll often see her fans attempt to reframe and redirect. Choosing to publish outside the traditional channels is, they might argue, revolutionary and brave, and in some way elementally superior to traditional paths. One of the major benefits of following poetry's traditional publishing track is that, by the time a poet reaches the end of it, a good number of individuals will have essentially given the poet an endorsement. For a single poem to be published in a single reputable literary magazine, it will have had to pass through at least one gatekeeper in the form of the magazine's poetry editor, likely in addition to paid or volunteer poetry readers. When a poem is accepted for publication and then later appears in print or online or both, it bears an implied seal of approval, not just from the poetry editor, but from the magazine's other editors, management, sponsors, and the brand of the magazine itself as well. That is a lot of people and entities giving a single poem a thumbs up, which ideally says something about the poem's quality, especially when you consider that the vast majority of preliminary readers, genre editors, and magazine management at these higher level magazines hold at least an MA or an MFA and maybe even a PhD. Now imagine that an author publishes a book of poems and as many as half of the poems in that collection have undergone this kind of review. That is a lot of implied endorsements of a poet's ability coming from a lot of very skilled and very educated people. Reading Rupi Kaur's account of how she self-published, there's this palpable resentment towards literary quote-unquote gatekeepers in the publishing industry that she saw as impediments to her work. Again, from her website. Quote, "To surpass the gatekeeper would be looked down upon by my literary peers. I started submitting individual poems to anthologies, magazines, and journals. The result was one rejection after another. That's when I set my eyes on self-publishing, regardless of what the creative writing professor had said. I couldn't be held back by this gatekeeper who was never going to pay attention to me anyway." First of all, not to be an asshole, but that isn't what surpass means. When an editor accepts your poems for publication, you haven't surpassed them. They aren't like bosses in a video game that your poems have to defeat in order to achieve publication. Instead, I think what she meant was circumvent, and this is exactly one of the reasons that having editors and publishers to check your work can be helpful. They usually at least catch stuff like this. In any case, Kaur pretty clearly seems to view the publication industry as a series of gatekeepers designed to exclude certain voices, and she is onto something here, so let's get into it real quick. When Kaur and her fans refer to traditional publishers as gatekeepers, they aren't strictly incorrect. Traditional publishers do hold institutionally backed power over the kind of work that gets promoted to the public and that which doesn't. But before things get conspiratorial here, let me say that no, this doesn't mean that publishers secretly collude with one another in shadowy, smoke-filled rooms to ensure that certain voices are excluded. Mostly what it means is that the poems and books that get the most press are those that suit the tastes of editorial teams who, yes, tend to be white, wealthy, coastal, and liberal. Again, this is not the result of a deliberate effort to boost exclusively certain types of voices, but rather a frustrating product of bias. It's something we all struggle with, or rather would struggle with if we ran literary magazines and publishing houses of our own. If I ran a publishing house, say, it would be pretty likely that the books it put out into the world would have a higher than average percentage of religious and Scott Pilgrim and Kafka-related content, even if I wasn't deliberately trying to boost it, because I naturally favor that kind of stuff. And yes, Kaur and company are right that publishers do have disproportionate say in what kind of material gets financial backing, and they're right when they claim that women of color are more likely to face exclusion than other groups, even other marginalized groups. But Kaur fundamentally misunderstands the kind of gatekeeping that's happening here. Kaur would have you believe that publishers sit behind their desks cackling with glee as they toss rejected manuscripts into some kind of big fire. Gatekeeping is not the goal of publishers, as she implies, but rather, in 99% of cases, an outcome of having access to limited money and time with which to support only a finite number of books and writers. Above all, publishing houses' goal is to make money, and so they are incentivized to publish the books they think will see the biggest returns. They do take risks on other books as well, but ultimately, it's about income. This is why, once Kaur's self-pubbed version of M&H proved its marketability, a publisher offered her a deal, and you'll notice that Kaur suddenly had no problem allying herself with so-called gatekeepers then. Just to be really clear, academic poets don't tend to have a negative view of self-published poetry because we secretly know that's where all the quote-unquote real poetry is happening and we see it as competition or as a threat. We tend to take that view because self-published poetry collections tend to be written by people with little to no experience reading and writing poetry. In an interview with weird business guru guy Lewis Howes, Kaur even numbers herself among such people, adding to her story about the naysaying professor that she knew nothing about the poetry industry at the time, and that all of her experience came from writing short poems for teens on Instagram and Tumblr. Like a lot of conversations around cultural issues happening today, there's this undercurrent of anti-intellectualism and anti-establishment bias in defenses of Kaur's work. While there is plenty to criticize about the publishing industry, Kaur isn't actually offering us those salient critiques. Instead, she's more invested in framing publishers as the villains in her personal story so that she, by virtue of posing herself as their opposition, can perform the role of a morally upright revolutionary. This, in turn, allows Kaur and company to transform any conversation about the quality of her poetry into one about the necessity of her sticking it to big book. Identity politics actually has a lot to do with Kaur's ability to redirect conversations in this way, and in my original draft of this essay, I had a section here unpacking the way Kaur and her fans weaponize her identity as an immigrant woman of color in order to hijack discussions of her work. But I ultimately decided that I, being white and neither a woman nor an immigrant, was not the right person to be leading those types of conversations. Instead, I am going to point here to an excellent article by the aforementioned Chiara Giovanni, a writer and critic with a PhD in comparative literature, who outlines Kaur's misuse of identity politics. I really can't recommend this article enough, and I think it does an excellent job of filling in a gap that I am intentionally leaving wide open in the middle of this essay. Whew, okay, that was another long digression, so let's get back now to the text of good old M&H itself. It's no surprise, if you read the title, that religion is a motif throughout the collection, and it shows up both in the contents of the individual poems as well as the tone of the entire book. I mean, listen to the way the speaker gives her patented life advice in this little sampling of poems. Okay, so here's one. You must enter a relationship with yourself before anyone else. And here's another. I thank the universe for taking everything it has taken and giving to me everything it has given. Balance. And finally, here is a third. It takes grace to remain kind in cruel situations. And one more, just for shits and giggles, why not? Fall in love with your solitude. Let's go back now to that interview I quoted from earlier with that weird business guy, where Kaur describes her philosophy of judgment-free writing. Here it is in her own words.
When I'm writing, I let it flow out of me without any judgment. And the moment that it starts to not feel good and I get to a place where I'm like, there's some friction, I stop. I'm not forcing myself to sit there for 5 to 8 hours a day and write the way I force myself to do that with The Sun and Her Flowers. Wow. I'm like, listen, if I can get an hour in, if I can get 2 hours in, it's good enough for me. And then, I go, after I leave the cafe, I go home and I might spend like a few hours editing if the flow is sort of coming and it's happening. Because for me, poetry is a form of spirituality. It was never a job or a career. And I think when all the big metrics came, it was like, oh my God, this is my job, this is my career. And I began to stop treating it like a form of spirituality. And now I've sort of, after 10 years, like come full circle to that moment where I'm like, okay, no, this is a form of spirituality. It's where I'm most connected to myself. So why would I ever bring judgment into that space?
Wow.
Remember in the previous section when I referenced the fact that sometimes writing will be hard? Well, as much as I absolutely believe in the value of the workshop as well as that of editors and alpha and beta readers, one skill I have found critical to my own writing success has been the ability to self-diagnose. The thing is, if you write long enough, you will probably eventually reach a point where you write more poems or short stories or novel chapters than other people are able to look at. So eventually, you're going to have to be able to identify and address your own weaknesses. What Kaur has done, whether she realizes it or not, is create a paradigm in which any kind of rigor, that is the application of a critical lens to her own work, is not just antithetical to her poetry practice, but is actually a kind of personal heresy. I mean, think about it. If poems are spiritual messages delivered to her by the universe intended for you, the reader, then to edit them would be to intervene in the universe's divine, personalized messaging, and if that's true, it actually would be pretty fucked up of her to tinker with that. Handily, though, this setup also provides a very damn effective rhetorical shield against external critiques of her work. Suddenly, an issue with her personal poetics spirals into this criticism of her own spiritual practice, which a lot of people will be much more hesitant to approach in the first place, and others will rush to defend. I find this move to be highly suspect. It feels like cheating, or like she has activated a trap card or something, and while Kaur herself is smart enough never to directly state that her poems are beyond critique because they're a product of her faith, it is what she's implying. Now, I don't think that Kaur is lying about her spiritual beliefs in order to protect her work from criticism. I take her at her word here. I think she really does believe this, and I also suspect that it serves a very specific psychological purpose for her. What she has done for herself is this: essentially, protect herself from all of the difficult aspects of writing. I hope it won't sound grim when you say that if you're someone who intends to take writing seriously, then sometimes it will be work. If you intend to achieve mastery of either prose or poetry, or God forbid both, there will be times when it sucks to write, but it'll have to be done. I mean, it should not suck all the time. If writing is making you miserable, then it's probably time to consider a change of hobbies, but writing can't be this completely euphoric experience, no matter how much your high school creative writing teacher might have billed it as a path to totally fulfilling self-expression or whatever. If Kaur wants to keep a journal of her personal spiritual experiences, that's fine, but to me, breaking that journal into lines won't and doesn't automatically make it poetry. Kaur's goals with her book, which seem to include welcoming the reader to participate in her religious experience, are perfectly fine. But we're beyond the scope of what poetry as an artistic medium can accomplish here, at least as Kaur currently engages with it. Poetry isn't when big feelings happen and I write them down. Poetry is an arrangement of rhetorical and literary devices, and until Kaur engages with them, until she learns to separate the feelings that inspire her work from the poems themselves, her ability to recreate her spiritual moments as lyrics will remain severely limited. When it comes to Milk and Honey specifically, there's also this massive Bible allusion hanging over the entire collection, which I don't think you'll be surprised at this point to hear that Kaur barely even engages with. In the introduction, Kaur tells us that the title comes not from the Bible, but from a poem not included in the collection itself. It's one that she wrote when she was an undergrad, and in this poem, as she describes it, the women survivors of the 1984 Sikh massacre in India are, quote, smooth as milk and thick as honey. This is meant to characterize them as resilient, so charitably, Kaur is taking a symbol from the Bible, where milk and honey is used as a synonym for bountiful, and reclaiming it for use as a symbol of feminine strength. That's an awesome idea conceptually, but in its execution, it falls apart. The fact that the line Kaur wrote in undergrad is itself a biblical allusion is completely unacknowledged within the introduction, and Kaur goes on to sprinkle in these milk and honey images throughout Milk and Honey, using it at times as a symbol for sexual pleasure and at others as one for wealth. You might think that this second use, wealth, is a nod to the biblical meaning of the phrase, but even if it is, why is it there? Why has Kaur told us she's going to use the phrase in one way, that is, as a symbol of feminine strength, and then gone and used it in the traditional sense? It just seems contradictory. So, while it's fitting that a text with clear interest in spirituality would have a name drawn from the Bible, it only makes sense on a superficial level. As with much in Kaur, it fails to be specific. Why is she referencing the Bible in particular? What about the contents of the Bible or the associations of various Bible stories does Kaur want to highlight? How do the Bible's specific religious truth claims complement or contrast her own belief system? If there's anything to say about Kaur's work, it's this: it continually punishes you, the reader, by causing you to waste your own time asking questions without answers. And yet, I suspect that for Kaur, a reader noticing the connections that I'm noticing and going, I wonder what that's about, would be enough. It doesn't matter that she hasn't equipped us to arrive at any interesting conclusions. That we asked the questions at all and felt they must be deep ones is, for Kaur, I think, satisfactory. I said at the beginning of this essay that I have written my own Milk and Honey, but now that I'm at the end here, I am no longer sure if that's really true. My poem fragments are seeds that I fully intend to nurture in the hopes that they'll grow into complete works in their own time. And of course, there will be ones that don't, and the ones that don't won't have been wasted. The effort that I put into writing them will be themselves the foundation of the next poem that I do finish writing. I don't believe each poem is delivered to me in its entirety by the universe or spirit or God, and I honestly think that if we are to take Kaur literally on this point, it's a pretty frickin' weird thing to say. It transforms each critique of her work into a personal attack of her religious practice, which is an effective rhetorical sidestep that puts her critics on their back feet and makes it impossible to really engage with her work as work. After all, if the poems are delivered by the universe or other divine force, what work has Kaur actually done? And what can readers do but gawk or ask for more wisdom? So, what is there to say about Rupi Kaur and her first book, the good old Milk and Honey? Well, with only a few exceptions, the poetry is shallow or hollow, depending which metaphor you prefer, but countless other videos here on YouTube, to say nothing of the internet-spanning opinion pieces, both salient and not, can and have been telling us that for nearly a decade and a half now. At this point, I think it's time to change the conversation on Rupi Kaur. We are well past the point culturally where pointing and laughing is useful or even entertaining, if it ever was either of those things. It's time to start looking more closely at how she, as a writer who will be with us for a while, interacts with the medium of writing, the community that she fosters, and how she leverages identity politics, which you'll find more about in the Giovanni article. And besides, there is so much more to be learned, as there always is here at the SBU English Club, when we look at the things Kaur's poetry does do, and the ways that those things interact with our broader culture. Thanks so much for listening. Hey there, clubmates. Thanks for tuning in to the second in our series on Instapoetry. Extra thanks to our patrons Evil Red Flame, Ren, Jimmy Smith, Ace, Mallard Griff, Hobby Moth, Natalia T, Ivari Nye, Aiden Feltkamp, Pink Catsy, Simply FJ, and Drikoleth for supporting us through channel memberships. If you're interested in supporting us, you can become a channel member or make a one-time contribution through our PayPal or Ko-Fi, link to everything in the bio. There's plenty more Instapoetry out there that bears examining, so if you've been enjoying these, please do let us know in the comments below, and I will keep them coming. If there's something else that you'd like to see covered, though, just leave a comment saying so, and I will look into it. You can also always find us on Instagram and Twitter at SBU_English Club, or on Blue Sky under a different but pretty similar @ You can also find both Andrew and I on Goodreads and Letterboxd if you know where to look, and check out our website at EnglishClubPodcast.com to see where our other work is being published. Thanks a ton for coming to Club today, and I'll see you all around campus.